So I give the floor to my colleague over C47 for a short welcome and some word about the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Liana. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this interactive session. I'm Breno Gringo. I'm the outgoing president of C47, the Social Classes and Social Movement Research Committee. And we're very glad to have this joint session here together because, of course, you know, the main topic of the conference of this World Congress was about this resurgent authoritarianism. And we, working in the AC47 with labor movements, AC44 with labor movements, 47 and 48 with social movements, we put the session together to think the relationship between social movements and this increasing authoritarianism and anti-democratic wave that we're living all around the world. And of course, this was a permanent threat to social movements in terms of historical discussion that we had on high-risk activism, how activists are facing different violent threats. But I mean, there is something, or at least what we would like to discuss is that there is something new also in this moment in terms of normalization of far-right policies, far-right behaviors, in terms of new ways of controlling social movements and activists, the monitoring and digital control of activists, the withdrawal of financial resources, like all the rendering of several collective action repertoires as illegals, all the strategic use of pro-government, anti-democratic mobilization against progressive movements, all the counter-movements that are also arising in these moments. So there are a lot of things and new issues to discuss in this moment, and we will have two wonderful presentations here, just to contextualize a little bit, and I hope you will have a wonderful session, and I will leave the floor from our colleague and friend Tova Bensky that will moderate our debate. Thank you very much.
Well, good day, everybody. As Breno said, we have only two presentations left, and I will moderate it. My name is Tova Bensky, and I'm the former president of RC48 and member of the outgoing executive committee. As we are left with two presentations, each presentation will have 25 minutes. And then there will be time for questions. I will just put the alarm clock on the phone to ring after 20 minutes, and then you will know you only have another 5 minutes. I would like to call our first presenter, Michael Gillan from the University of Western Australia, and he will talk about authoritarian innovations and labor government in Myanmar, or reform. I don't see the last one. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this integrated session. I should just say before I begin that this is a paper that I have co-authored with Michelle Ford from the University of Sydney, who I think I just spotted sneaking into the back of the auditorium. Hi, Michelle. And I'd also like to acknowledge this is part of a broader multi-year research project which was conducted with Associate Professor Tue Tue Thane from Curtin University, who participated in all of the rounds of fieldwork that underpin this particular piece of research. So this particular paper is framed around the concept of authoritarian innovations, which I'm going to assume most of you are perhaps not familiar with, because it itself is a kind of novel term that comes out of the literature on democratisation and authoritarian practices. And you can see here a definition from Curato and Fossati, who describe authoritarian innovations as novel governance practices designed to shrink spaces for meaningful public participation in politics. So it's one of the important contributions, we think, of this idea of authoritarian innovations, is that it shifts the discourse and the frame from a discussion of authoritarianism and democracy at the macro level of political regimes to thinking about authoritarian practices in governance at the meso level. So we're actually thinking about what do governments do, what do state authorities do that actually shrink the available space for democratic participation, for voice, and in the case of our interests, for voice in the workplace and voice on the part of workers in terms of expressing their concerns and their interests. And Curato and Fossati and other authors have used this term, authoritarian innovations. Quite importantly, note that these innovations often and typically occur gradually, incrementally, or through the careful redesign of institutions. So they're subtle, and certainly much more subtle than the standard repertoire of actions of authoritarian regimes that use strong forms of coercion and violence to suppress social movements. So they occur gradually, they're subtle, and they sometimes disguise themselves in the language of democratic values and democratic practices. They try to legitimate themselves with reference to democracy itself, even though they are winding back the available space for workers, for social movements to contest authoritarian governance. In the labour space, we see this as an important means of actually interpreting practices that claim to uphold democratic values and in fact be compliant with international labour standards, but actually restrict the real space, the genuine space that is there for worker voice and participation in and beyond the workplace in labour institutions. And we're also interested in this because it focuses at the meso level rather than the macro level at actually thinking about these authoritarian innovations in labour governance across a range of different political regime types. So if you're interested, and this is a bit of an advertisement for another session that's happening tomorrow, Saturday morning at 10:30 for the RC44 program, we have a paper session on authoritarian innovations in labour governance, where we'll be having papers on Mexico, on India, but also on the United States of America, because we think you can actually think about this concept across a range of different regime types. So the particular approach and method that we've used in the case of this paper is to focus on this meso level of labour institutions, labour governance, with regard to trade union rights and institutional participation. In Myanmar, a country which has a tumultuous political history over the last decade, which many of you perhaps are familiar with. This is a country that moved from coercive authoritarian governance towards a kind of form of hybrid democratic governance at the macro political regime level. So you actually have a military-dominated state that engages in a range of political, economic and institutional reforms, shifts the country somewhat towards a hybrid form of democracy, but still with embedded authoritarian characteristics. And of course, over the last couple of years, we've had a military coup in Myanmar and the country's reverted back to coercive authoritarian governance. So the focus in this paper is in this reform era where there's an opening up of democratic space. And our interest is to see, well, what happens with labour governance in this particular time frame. And on the one hand, we see a range of reforms, legal and institutional reforms in labour governance in this era of democratic experimentation and reform in Myanmar that open up the available space for workers to express voice and to participate, democratically in and beyond the workplace. On the other hand, we also see the way these labour institutions were designed from the beginning really constrained the expression of that voice. It put boundaries around it. And later we see an unwinding of the available space for workers as well in terms of the functioning of what we would term authoritarian innovations. This paper is based, as you can see here, on different rounds of field work that the team did in Myanmar, focusing on workers' rights and working conditions And you can see it's multi-year fieldwork, but it's also got this temporal space in it, in the sense of actually observing different periods of time in which we see the shaping of institutions and the practices that underpin state governance of labour relations. So a few words on labour reforms in Myanmar. In Myanmar, reforms to labour governance and labour institutions essentially began in 2011 when a USDP government in Myanmar, and the USDP is a military-associated political party, began to initiate a range of political and institutional reforms. There was the release of political prisoners, there was a lot of engagement with international actors, a range of different economic reforms, and also greater space for media and civil society in terms of political expression. And gradually we saw the reintroduction into political life of the National League for Democracy, the main political opposition to the military historically.